Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be asked to speak on this topic. When I started thinking about the subject and just how huge it is and how much you have to dig down, I decided that all I could do is a few highlights. In other words, I'm not going to present you the findings of a results-based evaluation of what we've happened on the continent in the decade. I'm going to present just a few highlights and trends. And I have interviewed a few of the GLTN partners to try and also build up those highlights. I've been personally extremely privileged to be part of the work that has been done here in Africa over the last decade, while I've headed the UN Habitat and Global Land Tool Network since 2003. And have been very privileged to be part of the LPI process that has happened prior to 2009 and the adoption of the declaration, as well as since then. As we all know, through LPI and through GLTN, I have come to know a lot of committed people on this continent who seem to work day and night to realize a shared dream to have security of tenure for all on the continent, including for the poor and for women, to underpin economic growth and poverty reduction. And I have participated in the triumphs and the sacrifices of these people. Of course, a key person that I'm mentioning here, who was there at the beginning and who's still with us, of course, is Dr. Joanne Kagwanja. Other people have joined, but she has been from the beginning. So we must really understand and support her in every endeavor for the years of sacrifice that she has made. So when we think about the last decade, highlights and trends, it's not just about what happened, what events or historical trends, but it's also about people and champions who've worked and struggled together here. I'm going to start with one particular key aspect and try and underline its significance. It's about the LPI 2009 initiative. We are now celebrating its biannual conference. But many of us take this continental architecture for granted and what it stands for. And I want to compare and contrast this continent with other regions in the world and show what LPI in fact means. And we are going to look at it through the eyes of GLTN partners. Let me tell you that GLTN is a network of 66 international partners from all over the world, including multilaterals and bilaterals, like UNECA, World Bank, UN Women. It is supported by, it's basket funded by Netherlands, Sweden, and Norway. It also includes urban and rural civil society, many of whom are here, SDI, High Commission, Action Aid, and many others. It includes professional organizations like the International Federation of Surveyors, International Union of Notaries, training and research institutions like the Association of African Planning Schools, the University of ITC Twente, and so on. I'm just naming a few. And the focus of GLTN partners has been to develop the 18 missing land tools which are needed at global level, such as pro-poor land information management systems, some of which you can see here presented in the program, like land-based financing, indicators, costing and financing of land administration services. These are all on the program. I'm not going to refer to them in detail. Now, in 2013 in The Hague, at a GLTN partners meeting of over 60 partners in the world, these meetings allow us to understand what is happening at quite a lot of detail. One of the agenda items was to split into working groups by region and develop a work plan. Well, the Africa group went off and came back after a detailed discussion of which countries should be prioritized. That was no surprise to these people, to us. But the Latin American Caribbean group came back and said that the first step needed was to scope what the issues were of the region. Now, we did that in Africa, 2007 and 2008. The Asia-Pacific group had a lead partner. There was no lead partner in South America and Latin America. The lead partner for Asia-Pacific was UNESCAP, which is the UNECA equivalent for Asia Pacific, stretching from the Middle East to the other side of the Pacific. GLTN has done a lot of work to support UNESCAP. Now, what evolved was that this year there was a meeting held by UNESCAP, FAO and UN Habitat for the Asia Pacific region on the land sector. The first time the land sector had met as a group of the entire region. However, unlike LPI, which always had the AU as the umbrella for the initiative, there was no political or government umbrella for the meeting. We immediately realized at the meeting that there were significant problems about this, because with land you can't deal with land without governments or politicians. So we had to start thinking about how we were going to even bring in governments through finding champion governments, let alone move to a political umbrella. What I'm saying is, the more we know how special LPI is as a model to be learned from. It's unique. Other continents are years, possibly decades behind Africa. But they know they have to walk the same path in this globally connected world. So we need to value much more that we have such a coherent, structured, politically linked, comprehensive, bottom-up, top-down approach with work plans, finance, staffing, policies, communication systems, reporting structures to the highest level, a CSO NGO platform, a development partner platform, and all the other incredible things that have been built by the process that has created LPI and what LPI is today. We must never take it for granted, but must protect it as something which people in other regions aspire to. So for me, we had no LPI 10 years ago. Now we have a shared continental vision about what are the issues we are trying to address, a land policy framework, and what should be the key elements, including land governance. And remember, 10 years ago, we weren't even using the word land governance. Now it's central to our work. We weren't even talking about large-scale land acquisition. Now LPI has a special work stream around it. Secondly, we have a political framework for this shared vision under the leadership of the AU. And thirdly, we have leadership and a platform around where we can meet, implement a work plan together, and hold conferences like this one. This is all a major achievement. Now, I want to look at another aspect where Africa has been a major contributor to the global debate on land and has become a leading provider over the last decade of technical innovation. Currently, there are very few large-scale conventional land administration projects being undertaken in Africa. Ghana is probably only one that comes to mind. However, there are two countries that have provided us with new ways of doing land administration, which are more affordable and scalable, notably Rwanda and Ethiopia, the latter having over 20 million rural land parcels. If we look back to the 90s, and those of us who are working in the land sector, we knew in the 90s that our conventional land administration systems were not working for Africa because they were not appropriate, didn't fit customary systems, didn't take into account informal settlements. And remember that most African cities are over 60% informal settlement. And of course the affordability issue and the capacity issue. We also knew that many countries had introduced new land policies which could not be implemented at scale because we did not have the appropriate tools necessary. Klaus Deininger of the World Bank had just finished his 2003 work on land policies for growth and poverty reduction. And the bank had been working for years to get new evidence about what were more appropriate approaches. We tried to develop the source book that would underpin Klaus's work, but we didn't succeed because we didn't have the appropriate tools. And the source book would be necessary for the bank to change its policies at the bank board level. So really we are still at the 1970s World Bank policy in regard to operations. So in the 90s and early 2000s, those of us in the land sector realized we were stuck. We needed proper land management for our urban areas, watersheds, towns, but we didn't have the land administration systems that would allow us to do that. So, because we were stuck, we couldn't use conventional land administration systems to go to scale. Yet we had all these good land policies, but we had no pro-poor land tools. So the point I'm making is that we in Africa realized this first and started thinking about it and identifying what were the missing pro-poor gender-responsive tools we needed. The rest of the world thought they had solutions and only realized later that those solutions were also problematic. As a consequence of this, Africa led in the creation of what later became the GLTN Partners Agenda for the development of the 18 missing large-scale tools, which we all need, globally and in Africa, to be able to go to scale with land administration and security of tenure for all. In 2006, GLTN was launched to do this. And it was launched by international organizations, including donors, who shared the same vision and had the same dreams. So, a decade ago, we were stuck. We knew what tools we needed, but we didn't know how to move forward. A decade later, we are well on the way to the development of these 18 missing tools. I thought personally it would take 40 years. A couple of years ago, I thought it would take 20 years. I'm now hoping by the end of 2017. And, importantly, the World Bank is still in the lead together with the International Federation of Surveyors and have launched a publication called Fit for Purpose Land Administration, allowing us to have the whole range of land administration systems, not just the conventional. And GLTN will fund the guidelines that will underpin this Fit for Purpose publication so that it will become made concrete, working with GLTN partners and member states. And this kind of work will define how land administration systems are designed and strengthened in the next 10 years, which in turn will contribute to the successes of governments and the quality of life of citizens. One of the critical turning points in the continent in the last 10 years has been a move away from registered freehold rights only to other forms of tenure. Africans are well aware that we have an enormous range of different types of tenures, and they cover a wide range of territory in each country. Conventional systematic titling approaches of the last century often failed in Africa to deliver the expected results, precisely because they could not accommodate customary tenure systems and the way people think about land. They've also failed in cities because of, among other things, affordability and capacity issues. At the beginning of the decade, freehold was still very much king. Now we are in a completely different place. Through a careful process of consultations and negotiations and discussion, LPI and people like the late Professor Okoth Agendo, who we recognize as a key architect of LPI's framework and guidelines, brought customary tenure onto the table as a tenure type which should be seen as equal and as valuable as freehold. This approach was enshrined in the LPI framework and guidelines, as well as what they call a variety of tenure forms. This broader approach was then echoed in the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure, forestry and fisheries led by FAO, finalized in 2012. And customary tenure was once again brought to the fore, as well as the promotion of all forms of legitimate tenure. And as Harold Liversidge, who has also been with this process from the beginning, would remind us, customary tenure is a system used by ordinary people in the rural areas, such as smallholder farmers, who we must remember produce the majority of the food we all eat. So it is a system which the rural poor often rely on as their major asset. It is a system which is crucial for fragile states and those in conflict as the default tenure when central and local state systems fail. Customary tenure is now also being seen as useful to women This was not true a decade ago. Another GLTN partner, Huayro Commission, had reminded us recently by Jan Pedersen, who has been in the women's movement for, I'm not going to ask her. She has tracked discussions inside the global women's movement for decades. And the acceptance of customary tenure as useful for women has only been a recent phenomenon, possibly only within the last 2 or 3 years. We are also seeing in this decade that national governments are more and more embracing customary governance and tenure as useful for managing land. And I could give you a number of examples. Also, if we look back 10 years, we have seen significant changes in the way donors are approaching also the land sector. The Paris Accord critically influenced the relationship between donors and the developing world governments. We have seen changes in civil society, where we have moved from LandNet, West Africa and East Africa, to building the capacity of ILC, to a global, a continental platform that was set up by LPI, working with civil society in Dakar last year. We have seen a situation where the best and brightest Africans used to get their PhDs outside of Africa. That is no longer true. We now have PhDs staffing African universities and have their own PhD graduates. I could give you some more details on that. We also have seen the introduction of the African peer review mechanism, where over 30 countries have been identified with land issues that need to be engaged with. We now enact laws which we cost first. We are developing comprehensive land indicators, which we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago. Now, policy people and technical people sit together in the room and design. Previously, it wasn't like that. The rural and urban agenda are seen together. Yes, I have to admit the urban agenda is still a younger child, but at least we are sitting together in the same meetings. So what I'm saying is, we can celebrate what we have achieved in this decade on this continent. Of course, there are many challenges in the next decades. Massive urbanization, population growth with a huge youth bulge of 50% of our population at some point in the future, climate change impact and food insecurity, land conflict and massive numbers of IDPs and refugees, particularly in the Great Lakes region. However, the important thing is that we have laid down the continental architecture needed to take us forward, as well as the networks, the friendships, the understandings that give us the strength and resilience that we need to meet the challenges of the next decade. Let us continue to strengthen LPI and our work together to serve the people of the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarissa, for that comprehensive presentation. I understand I have been really pushing you to the corner in terms of time, but I'm sure you will have an opportunity to interact with participants more during the discussion. So we have the opportunity of getting this from this presentation, that we have today what we didn't have 10 years ago, in terms of frameworks, in terms of tools, in terms of capacity, in terms of better grasp of the issues, and so on. I am sure this will be enriched as we continue to have the presentations from the other speakers, and further when we open the floor for discussion. Now, we are going to zoom in on one strategic issue in the context of the, this basic question: what have we learned from efforts to secure land rights in Africa and women's rights, as you know, is very strategic. It has been a sticking point, and Uber is going to shed some light on this particular issue. Uber, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abebe, and thanks for highlighting the importance of the topic on women land rights. I think it's a very important topic, but also very complex and sometimes controversial. So I'm building on a study made by the LPI in 2013. I don't know if the PowerPoint is on. Next slide. Let me start by highlighting why why the LPI has undertaken the study on women's land rights. During the regional consultations for the preparation of the framework and guidelines, the women land right has been identified as one of the priority issues in Africa, and also as one of the commonalities. When we did the regional consultations, we identified that we had commonalities but also specificities. But the issue of women land right was really across the continent. The framework and guideline has highlighted the paradox of the women's role in development and agriculture, and at the same time the marginalization of women when it comes to access and control over the land. And finally, let me highlight the AU Declaration on Land, which is a declaration of African heads of state and government. The African heads of state resolved to strengthen security of land tenure for women, which require special attention, meaning that they have specifically highlighted and prioritized the need to strengthen the land right of women. And that's why the LPI strategic plan for the implementation of the AU declaration has in its objective 5 dedicated to knowledge generation, decided to conduct a study on women land rights in support of advocacy activities, of capacity building, and also in support of evidence-based policy making. Next. I would say that let's start by highlighting that land is so important to Africa's development. But I will not insist because all speakers have highlighted this. Land is important in agricultural development, but it's also important in other sectors, including urban development, mining, tourism. This has been clearly highlighted. And women are key actors in African development. I will not insist either because I think that yesterday you saw the high table. The number of women on this table was quite impressive, meaning that when it comes to land, women have really something to say about it. Women play an important role in development, but there are a lot of constraints to their full engagement in development, and land is one of those constraints. Let's contextualize about, a little bit about the issue of land in development. We are in Africa, and we are in societies which are dominated by systems of patriarchy, where women are perceived mainly as dependents, and in some cases treated as workforce. Some authors consider that the system of polygamy is partly based on the fact that a family needs more workforce for the field. Women are excluded in decision-making in the systems of patriarchy. This is based partly on the cultural perception of land. Land is sacred resource, and it's linked to the ancestor worship. And we are in societies where we have kind of strict division of roles. You have roles for men, you have roles for women. And this leads to exclusion of women from land administration institutions. You will see that in most cases, land is governed by traditional land chiefs, and you will hardly see a woman being in charge of administering the land. And women are excluded in most cases from the control and ownership of the land through the inheritance systems, through access sometimes to marginal lands, and also through persisting tenure and security. I would say that there are some exceptions. It's important to mention. Even in the traditional system, you have exceptions where women are owning the land. And I have documented some of them in Burkina Faso, some of them have been documented in Niger, and so on. When it comes to modern laws and regulations, we have a common principle, which is the principle of non-discrimination. All countries have laws and constitutions which are based on non-discrimination, principle of non-discrimination. Most countries also have adhered to international convention and regional instruments. But in practice, women's land rights remain precarious. Most laws, including those modern laws based on non-discrimination, are cementing the dominant system of patriarchy. One good example provided is that usually the title is allocated by the government to the chief of household. But the system of patriarchy will insist that the chief of the household is a man. And you also have in those systems the persistence of traditional practices which exclude and maintain women from access and control over the land. And finally, we have issues of governance. Even in countries where you have positive laws, laws which provide the right for women to own the land, these laws are not effective because of issues of governance, because of issues related to the rule of law. Next, please. Let's also understand that African societies are in transition. There are increasing number of de facto women household chiefs. More and more women are household chiefs due to migration, due to the HIV, and so on. Due to conflicts, we also are in a context where Africa is experiencing a lot of conflicts. And women are the most important victims, women and children. We all know what is happening in certain conflict areas where we have forced eviction, and when you see the people moving, most of them are women and children. You have issues of rapes in most cases, and issues related to religious fundamentalisms, and so on. But Africa is also the continent with extremely rapid urbanization. And I think that this rapid urbanization is creating opportunities for women advancement through education, through employment. And we have a relatively more effective implementation of the land laws. For example, in most cities, you'll see that women are able to access land through allocation. They can just ask for a plot, and they might be able to get an allocation. And some of them who have resources can also access land through markets. So these are just elements to show that we are in changing situations. Is it possible, next please, is it possible to change this situation? I think so. And the framework and guideline is highlighting three important things. First, excluding women from control of land is anti-economic, meaning that Africa cannot afford today excluding half of its rural producers from access to the main factor of production. And it's assumed that more productive and more sustainable use of land requires that land rights of women are secured. Second thing is that exclusion of women from control of land is undemocratic. And the framework and guideline insists that we need to move women's land rights from the private sphere of marriage to place it on public domain of human rights. But let's acknowledge that this is a complex process. How can we strengthen the rights of women while respecting social family relations? How to empower women themselves to be able to access and own their land rights? Some of the promising avenues, next please. Some of the promising avenues, awareness raising. We are insisting that this is based on cultural practices. So advocacy, awareness raising is extremely important. Targeting government, targeting traditional leaders, targeting men, but also women themselves. Political will seems quite important. We can see that in some countries, when the leadership is really engaged, committed to strengthening the land rights of women, there are progress. One of the very interesting examples given in the literature is related to Tunisia, where the country in the 60s have made tremendous progress due to the political will of the leader of this time. We have other examples. Today, Rwanda, for example, is having 60% of parliamentarians being women. We see that in Ethiopia, women are allocated, the name of women are put equally on the land certificate. And other examples exist. It's important that advocacy campaigns are developed on the topic of women's land rights and that women champions are engaged in these campaigns. It's also important to promote affirmative action policies. One example that I can give is in West Africa, most countries now are advocating for a percentage of rural state land to be reserved for women. And it's also important to adjust laws in other areas than land. For example, civil registration is critical to enhancing the rights of people, because if you don't have, for example, an ID or an ID card, meaning that you cannot even go and register in the land registries. Next. Other elements are about documenting and disseminating best practices. And I have to highlight the LPI 30% target advocacy, meaning that by the next decade or more, 30% of the land allocated by the state should be owned by women, 30% of women with documented land right, 30% of women in land professions. Capacity development is also a very important area. Let's highlight also access to credit. You can have land, but you need access to credit to develop it. And gathering data for evidence-based advocacy and policy making. Next. Some of the ongoing initiatives by the LPI, We have the study that I have already mentioned. We have training sessions held on gender in partnership with UN Habitat. We have the guiding principle on LSLBI, which highlights the role and rights of women. And we are now conducting a gender and land strategy, and we are building synergy with the AU chairperson's special initiative on women's empowerment and political participation. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Uber. As I was passing a warning, he surprised me by thanking us. Thank you. Thank you so much for highlighting the unique features of access by women to land in this particular case. And of course, this is going to use, we're going to use this as the background to stimulate our discussions. Now, was it Clarissa who mentioned the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forestry that FAO has been leading? The AU framework and guidelines on land policy was adopted in 2009, and the FAO voluntary guidelines was adopted in 2012. And we might have come across a situation where, when it comes to Africa, why do we want to have several guidelines on land and framework? So this is an opportunity for us to see how these guidelines are not contradictory, but they are complementary. FAO has been working with us, and we are trying to see how we can support policy development on land using both, because both have been adopted by member states. It must be made very clear. And there is even another guideline. It's EU guidelines on land. So it's very important. I would like to thank Andrew for being available to share with us the experience of not only developing and getting it adopted, but also trying to operationalize it, and also in relation to the AU framework and guidelines on land policy. I would like to invite Andrew to give us his presentation. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. This session then is about what have we learned from efforts to secure land rights in Africa. And I'd like to spend this part of this session, sharing the experiences of the lessons that we've learned relating to the voluntary guidelines. This is the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of land, fisheries and forests. We should, if technology allows, have some slides. So we'll see if that it's on it. Oh, I can't see it on my monitor, but fine. Before answering the question of what have we learned, I'd like just to spend a couple of minutes reflecting on a couple of points. The first one being, about the problems of securing land rights. Now, these problems have been with us for a long time. It's nothing new. I think what is new, though, is that these problems seem to be growing in intensity and complexity due to a number of reasons. Some of the previous speakers have alluded to some of them. Rapid urbanization, for example, increases in population, not just within African countries and on the African continent, but also globally, and that's had an impact on other countries resourcing land and other natural resources in Africa. We've also had changing dietary patterns. We've also had demands for energy, and so we've had the impact of biofuels. So we've had these increasing competitions for natural resources. At the same time, many governments have been incapable of adapting to this rapid growth. And so this has led to a series of problems. I've got a few of them listed there. We won't go into them in detail, but we're all very familiar with them, and we all spend all of our daily lives dealing with these. These are the problems of tenure rights not being recognized, discrimination, forced eviction, state capture of natural resources, a limited capacity of states to cope. We're normally talking about land administrations. I'm a professional chartered surveyor. I've spent my entire career, much of it in Africa, dealing with these kind of problems. We're always under-resourced. The challenge is always out there. So we've got all of these problems, and they represent a Pan-African challenge, particularly in responsible, effective, and sustainable governance of natural resources. And we're here particularly to talk about land. Next slide, please. Yes, sorry, that one's on a trip. Yeah. Okay, the second point I wanted to make was that we now have in the voluntary guidelines a new strong tool in our kit bag. We've heard about other tools, about the F&G, and many other tools out there. In fact, this is a good point at which to promote a session that we're having, I think it is tomorrow, that will be making a comparison between the F&G and the VGs, the Voluntary Guidelines on Responsible Governance of Tenure, and we'll be looking at the synergies between those and what we're doing to roll out both of them across the continent. But with the Voluntary Guidelines, we've got a set of internationally negotiated principles where tenure systems and responsible governance are at the heart of it, and it's the first global document that we've ever seen like this. The nature of its development and its subsequent endorsement by a broad spectrum of stakeholders is really what gives it its strength. And I'd just like to briefly remind the audience here, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, how it came about. The voluntary guidelines were basically evolved from a series of consultations. We had teams of drafters involving various stakeholders, a wide variety of stakeholders. We held 15 consultations between 2009 and 2010 across the globe. This involved about 1,000 people. Almost 100 countries were involved, if I remember. And all of this information and input was brought together ultimately to have intergovernmental negotiations. Next slide, please. Thank you. And there we have a picture of the intergovernmental negotiations that were held at FAO headquarters in Rome. There was a series of negotiations. They culminated in the 12th of May 2012 with the Committee on World Food Security endorsing these guidelines. Now, this is important because of the strength that this has given us. These are not just another book of guidelines. We have a buy-in from all the member states. They were negotiated by this wide variety of stakeholders. Civil society was well represented, private sector was well represented. So whilst inevitably we have some kind of compromise in this document, it is nevertheless a very strong document, and we shouldn't get hung up too much on the fact that the first word in its title is voluntary. We'll see as we go through now that there's been a tremendous take-up. So I'd like now to just address what we mean by the lessons that we've learned regarding the voluntary guidelines. It's now been 2.5 years since their official endorsement. So I've just put down 6 of my thoughts that I think that are the lessons learned. There are many more. It's a very complex area, a very wide area, but I'd just like to take you through 6 what I think are important lessons that we've learnt so far that will have an impact on what we do in the future. So first of all, it's the wide variety of stakeholders that are already committed to supporting the application of the guidelines. These include international organizations, international financial institutions, governments, the private sector, civil society organizations, academia, and of course our development partners. And a note on our development partners, they have been tremendously supportive of the implementation of the voluntary guidelines. They have formed a global donor working group on land, of which FAO is a member. And this working group is there to coordinate the implementation of the voluntary guidelines globally and to share synergies and to share information. It's a tremendous initiative. I've got a slide here that will show just some of, and that's coming up in a minute, that will show some of the countries that they're working in. But just a quick run through these slides in terms of these organizations that are involved in the implementation of the voluntary guidelines. There are those that are calling for the implementation. So not just the Committee on World Food Security, but also many other organizations such as particularly sort of intergovernmental organizations, the Rio +20, we have the G8 who recently met, all of them supporting the implementation. Sorry, could you go back one slide, please? We have those organizations that are using their own programs. So here we have, for example, the World Bank and USAID. We have Oxfam. Interestingly, we have the names now coming out more and more of the private sector. This has been a tremendous development in the less than 12 months since Coca-Cola was the first to make the initial statement that they would ensure that their supply chain accords with the principles of the voluntary guidelines. That was a massive statement, and of course that has been followed now by its competitors, by Pepsi-Cola. I was at a conference for the private sector in Brussels just a few months ago. Nestlé presented at that conference, and they also said that their supply chain would conform with the principles of the voluntary guidelines. So we've got a tremendous buy-in from the private sector. Next slide, please. And then we have our own partnerships within our organizations. We just heard from Clarissa about GLTN. FAO has a wide variety of partners, and here are just some of them. The national flags there being our resource partners, our donors, who stepped up to the plate immediately following the endorsement of the voluntary guidelines, and they are funding most of FAO's work on implementing the voluntary guidelines. Next slide, please. Oh, that's a map. You probably won't be able to see it very, very well, but you will be circulated with these PowerPoints, and there's a web link on that slide, and it will take you to the Global Donor Working Group mapping of the projects that are being implemented by the group, the Global Donor Working Group. There are about $4 billion, just over $4 billion worth of investments that are linked to the voluntary guidelines in over 125 countries. And this is a tremendous effort across the globe. So I'm just sort of trying to paint a picture here of within the last couple of years, the lessons here are that we've got a tremendous buy-in. We already have this momentum, and this is something that the next points will link to in terms of how we must capitalize on this tremendous momentum. Next slide, please. My second lesson learned is a very simple one, that political will is crucial. Without the political buy-in, we'll be pushing at closed doors. So we must have this political buy-in. We recognize this. Here we have, with the support of the European Union, FAO has appointed a land tenure officer specifically to address this issue. Is based with LPI. Again, an example of an illustration of how partnerships are so important. And the main task there is to work through the regional economic commissions and other bodies to try and garner this political will. Because once we have the political will, then we can really move mountains. Rwanda, Hubert just mentioned Rwanda in a gender context, but also I'd like to showcase that country in terms of what they achieved with their systematic registration program. Within 3 years, they had the whole country registered. That's because the political will was there. In a post-conflict environment, they said, no, this can never happen again. We have to register everybody's rights, and they did it. Political buy-in, we really must have that. Now, importantly, it's not just about getting the top politicians to say, yes, we'll do it. We have to follow on with that and have a whole mental change. It really means about changing the way governments think, about the way people think, about how they will use their natural resources and who has the right to use those natural resources. Next slide. The third point in terms of lessons learned is also quite simple, and that is that the implementation of the voluntary guidelines is not simple, and there is no simple template. There are different tenure systems in different countries, there are different tenure models. And, you know, we often get asked the question, so how many countries have actually implemented the voluntary guidelines? And it's an impossible question to answer because even if a country states that it will implement the guidelines, first of all, we can't measure it at the moment. Secondly, it's an ongoing process. And what we are learning is that we are better off in addressing specific symptoms or systems, that we can actually try and identify and prioritize areas where we can apply the guidelines to help to resolve their problems. Really we're finding that from our experience, from FAO's experience, that this can best be achieved at the country level through multi-stakeholder discussions, through undertaking self-assessments of the countries to try and see where they're weak, where their problems are, what their priorities are. We'll be hearing later in the conference in detail about LGAF as one of the tools that can be used for that. And so by targeting specific issues, that will help us make progress. Next slide. Point number 4 is really about the voluntary guidelines being the catalyst for change and how we bring about that change. And there's a real need to raise awareness, not amongst ourselves. 2 years ago, we actually, if we were invited to address a conference, it was actually to explain what the guidelines are about. Nobody's asking that question now at conferences. They're saying, what are you doing about it? What's the latest implementation initiative? But out there at grassroots levels, and I'm sorry to say still at political levels, we still have a lot of awareness raising to do. We need to develop capacities, so even if we've raised awareness, there's a lot of capacity development that's required. We need to support countries directly, and all of us need to create synergies through partnerships, and then through monitoring the progress that we can make, or that we are making. By getting behind the voluntary guidelines, it's easier to move in the same directions, to lobby, to advocate, and to bring about change within the principles of the guidelines. The kind of areas that I've just identified are very much the areas that we're addressing through FAO's own global implementation program. So as I said, awareness raising, capacity development, country level focus, partnerships and cooperation, and monitoring and evaluation. Next slide, please. That again will show up more clearly when you get the copies, but it's a map, a global map of just some of the countries that we're working in as FAO, and the different types of areas that we're working in. So in some of these areas we're having awareness raising initiatives, in others we're supporting countries directly, in others we are capacity developing civil society, so that they can more meaningfully take part in discussions around multi-stakeholder platforms. And this is another lesson learned, that multi-stakeholder platforms are invaluable. Next slide, please. My 5th lesson is really just building on my previous one, and that is that stakeholders need to develop their own approach. Because we all have a part to play in this, no matter which organization we represent, whether we're civil society and grassroots level people, there's a role out there, there's a niche out there for us to play. So on the one hand, we need to play to our individual strengths. On the other hand, we need to build partnerships. And I think that this is one of the lessons that we've learned. And the private sector I mentioned earlier, it must be recognized as one of those stakeholders. We cannot achieve our development goals for the continent purely by public finance, purely by donor finance. We have to have private sector investment, but we need to make sure that it works for the benefits that we want it to work for, and not just for financial gain for private sector companies. So we need to harness that energy that's out there, that financial interest that is now being shown in this continent that wasn't there 10 years ago. There was very little financial direct investment in Africa 10 years ago. Now, because of this set of circumstances being changed, we've got tremendous interest. Well, let's not miss this opportunity. Next, let's make sure that we channel that interest to meet the principles of the voluntary guidelines and the other tools that we have out there. Next slide, please. My final point here in terms of lessons learned is that we must recognize that it's early days. You know, we all want quick changes. We're in a rapidly responding world these days that we want rapid responses to our emails, we want rapid responses to our text messages. You know, we all want immediate fixes. Well, that's not going to happen when we're talking about land. We're talking about very complex areas here. We're talking about legal infrastructures, constitutions even. We're talking about professional training. It takes, to become a chartered surveyor, you have to do 3 years professional training, 2 years of articles and professional guidance, yet another exam after that, just to become qualified to do a task. And we are going to talk later, I'm sure, about centres of excellence and how things are improving here in Africa. So we need to churn out property professionals, people who know what they're talking about, people who can deal with these problems in a practical way. And I think a closing slide that we'll just put on in a second here is the multi-stakeholder dialogue. One of the lessons that we've really learned from our approach, every country that we work in, we try and have an awareness-raising workshop that creates a multi-day stakeholder dialogue. That's our first step of engagement. And what this little slide shows here is that we bring people to the table that don't normally sit around the table and talk to each other. And this is really important. We have to get grassroots levels people sitting at the table with governments, sitting at the table with donors, with people that can fix things. Everybody who's involved, all of those stakeholders need to get around the table and talk, because unless we talk together, then we'll never find the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that presentation. I think it has been very helpful in terms of can we have the lights on, please, now? While waiting for the light so that we can see each other, as the AU, we are very efficient in terms of developing and getting adopted decisions and declarations. The single most important challenge we have been facing has been to see those decisions and declarations are leading to results through implementation. What has also been missing is the mechanisms for tracking progress, for monitoring and regular reporting on the outcomes and impacts of those decisions. this year, when we have the declaration, the Malabo Declaration on Africa's accelerated agricultural growth and transformation for shared prosperity and improved livelihoods, we paid particular emphasis on this aspect of implementation and implementation supports, tracking progress, and also making sure that there is a system of mutual accountability. So we said, and they have agreed, the heads of state agreed for a biennial, meaning every 2 years, review and report, including even recognition of better performance by those who can make a change. It's really a blessing that we have had these frameworks over the last decade. And it's not only that we've had the frameworks, the guidelines and so on, we've been able to make use of them. And it's a continuum. The process is set in motion. We need to sustain that momentum geared towards getting results on the ground along the goals that we have set for ourselves. So I would like to thank the presenters, all of them, for a very informative presentation, and the floor is now open for observations, comments, questions. But then, in view of the fact that we have to operate within very limited time, I would like to seek your indulgence to be very brief, to the point, so that more number of people can participate. So long statements and so on are not really encouraged. The floor is yours. It's open, and let me start from this direction. I will come this way. 2 people from here first. The farmer who is seated in front, and yes, please, very brief.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, Dr. Abebe. I want to thank all the presenters for the wonderful job. My question goes to FAO, to Andrew. Without any intention to challenge the scientific wisdom and the technical know-how that was employed in the development of the voluntary guidelines, I want to ask you some few questions. Guidelines, in another way, means a regulatory way of doing business. And why did you retain the word voluntary? The second point is, we had the F and G coming into being before the V and G. I would like to know from you, did you identify yourself with any issues that could be aligned in course of developing the V and G? This is because I fear there may be some conflict when it comes to implementation, because there may be some limitations in the implementation of the F and G. Meanwhile, I find the scope of the V and G more global. Personally, how do you situate the F and G, Andrew? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Musa Osman. I'm representing Boskuda from Cameroon. I don't have a question, but an observation. First, dealing on land and land advocacy especially entailed a lot of hard work, and sometimes you are treading on a dangerous terrain. Most land right defenders first what we call judicial or malicious judicial harassment. I therefore want to ask if there will be some mechanism in place to actually defend the right of land right advocate in our continent. Secondly, I want to observe that the African country generally adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People. But when it comes to implementing African land policy, the right of indigenous people are sometimes not quite emphasized. We are happy that the right of women as one of the marginalized groups is highly highlighted here. But I think it is also important to include the right of indigenous people of Africa. I want to observe that very few African countries have so far ratified the ILO Convention 169, and therefore I think this is a very important medium to still raise the issue of the ratification of the ILO Convention 169 to be able to have a tool that can defend the right of indigenous people. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you. In your presentation, I heard the support to the countries who is willing to implement the voluntary guidelines. And I would like I want you to explain whether the civil societies in the various countries can apply on their own as a civil society, taking the challenge up. You know, the awareness creation, we are on it. It's a tedious work, getting people together and then sensitize them on local FM stations because of the language barrier, and then on the main radio, on the main television. It costs a lot. And that is the main challenge that we are facing, and it's not making things work as we wish, especially the women. When we go to the rural areas and want to talk to the chiefs on land, because they are the cause of these problems, and the government, the higher decision-making people, it becomes very tough for us. So I want you to tell us how we can get support, actually where, so that we will be able to do the work well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for that.
Thank you, Chairman. Ibrahim Wadane from Kenya. I think we need to encourage and support.
Sorry, sir. It's to the guy who is seated towards your left that I gave the floor. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Barwani Mshale from the Center for International Forest Research, Nairobi office. Thank you all for the presentations. I have two quick questions. The first question is to Clarissa. You mentioned one of the previous problems was that some of the solutions proposed by different actors, such as the World Bank, were themselves problematic. So maybe if you can clarify a little bit the initiatives that are undertaken now, to what extent have you taken that into consideration to make sure that those solutions are not going to be problems in themselves? And then the other question is to Hubert. I like the language on the issues of women and land rights, saying like the exclusion of women is anti-economic, undemocratic, etc. But at the same time, I wanted to get your reflection a little bit to what extent this language is actually promoting positive change rather than creating more antagonism between these introduced institutions and structures with the pre-existing institution structures so that we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me give you the floor now since you started, but please be brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to indicate that we need to support and encourage the unique model highlighted by Clarissa, where we are converging technical processes with the political support in achieving our frameworks in Africa. and also appreciate that we now need to swing to country level, intensify country level actions, drawing from the frameworks, policy and political that have been so far achieved. Then quickly ask whether we, in that regard, are making progress in having land inform the Africa peer review mechanism as a way of urging on actions at country level, and if not, then strongly suggest that this forum should recommend that African Union takes that into consideration in future.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentations. My question goes to Hubert. You made a very inspirational comment on the fact that many countries have actually ratified some of these topics that we are talking about here. And you also noticed that, mentioned that the problem is not the policy, but the problem is there's always a gap between the policy and the practice. So in your opinion, what is there to be done? What is the problem that the policy actually are not being implemented on the ground? What can we do so that all the discussion do not just turn into blah blahs? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that.
My name is Floribert Nyamuga from the DR Congo National Commission for Land Reform. As I understand, all these beautiful tools are either developed or discussed in scientific or political fora, mainly in the framework of the African Union. And my perception is that you take it for granted that they are well known in all the countries which are members. Now, I think that in-country dissemination should take priority over actual implementation or monitoring and evaluation. And I would like to know if you've developed any strategies for using the usual dissemination platforms which exist in the countries, for example, universities, civil society organizations, or stakeholder forums, in order to make the largest number of potential participants to processes aware and with a mastery of these tools. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, the questions and the observations are focused on how can we make use of these wonderful frameworks and tools and so on. This is really, it comes in different forms. But what can we do to support implementation? That is, I think, the central message. And I would like to invite the panelists here to take 2 minutes maximum to respond to some of the questions, but also we will use the other sessions that are going to follow to elaborate more on these aspects, I'm sure. So, Clarissa, you want to come? Yes.
Thank you. It's easy for me, Chair, as I only had one question. Yes, in the development of innovative tools, what we have come to understand is that in the world we live today, nobody has all the answers. So one of the methodologies that is being used by GLTN is to bring partners around the table and all the people with technical knowledge to together to build the tools, to pilot them and keep validating them. Now, I've got an example, for instance, in Uganda, SDI, Act Together, a national NGO, Cities Alliance, Government of Uganda, and International Federation of Surveyors and ourselves, we all got together with the community to pilot what's called the social tenure domain model, and you'll find it on your program. It was then assessed by the community and is now working in 4 municipalities in Uganda, and Uganda wants to scale it to 40 municipalities. So we're talking now about a reference group which has much more knowledge and then validates over time, checks over time with the communities, not isolated from the communities. We are using a similar methodology to develop land indicators, to develop, and you can also hear a presentation on that, to develop a costing and financing of land administration services for land ministries, also for land-based financing, and that part linked to slum upgrading at scale with land readjustment, something that we have not done in Africa successfully, or even in the South successfully. This is going to take us many years to learn, but in the same kind of process. And just to draw to your attention that we had a question from the DRC government leading. We are using this Pro-Poor Land Information System to see whether we can move mediation records already operating in the east of DRC to have them more systematic for people to operate in a post-conflict environment. This is a very quick taste of the methodology. We can talk more, and a quick taste of the kind of tools that are innovative and for which we need to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarissa. Andrew, please, you have a lot of questions.
Yes, a lot of questions, but I'll try and answer them briefly. The first question I've got to address, obviously, is voluntary, from our friend from Cameroon. Why voluntary? A lot of people would have liked these not to have been voluntary guidelines, but if you look to the opposite of voluntary and make them mandatory, it's impossible to make the guidelines mandatory. Particularly as some of the principles contained there would conflict with national laws and so on. It really has to be a buy-in system. And there are precedents for having these kind of international soft laws prefaced by the word voluntary. So it was really the only working solution to get these out into the public domain. However, we then through all our agencies involved, are encouraging the take-up of these through, like we say, the General Assembly, through the Rio 20, through the G8, and so on, to actually make them mandatory. And once a country actually individually adopts them, then they will become mandatory. But had we had spent a lot of time negotiating on that one, and this was the compromise that had to come out. Another point that was raised was about the F&G, that the F&G came first. So how does that fit with the VGs? A lot of the organisations, particularly FAO, were involved in the development of the framework and guidelines. You know, we're all on the same page for this. Similarly, a lot of the organisations, LPI included, contributed very much to the VGs. And let's remember, there's nothing really new in the voluntary guidelines. A lot of these best practices and principles have been emerging for the last 10 years, but they've never been contained in one place, in one hard-hitting document that has security of tenure and responsible governance at its core. So that's the difference. So I don't see any conflict in the rollout, but for a fuller answer, I would encourage you all to go to the session tomorrow at 2 o'clock, where there'll be a focused discussion exactly on this. The other questions really probably fall into the category for one kind of simple answer. One was to how can we apply from grassroots levels for financial support to carry on our work. And another one was, where have I got that? Another one was a similar question about assistance. In the first, well, just to give a very quick introduction to how FAO works, we're not a financial institution. There's not a pot of money that we can say, just apply and you can have some money for this and some money for that. But all of our activities are funded by donor partners. So what I would recommend is that you go to FAO country office. We have representations in about nearly 80 countries, go to those, tell them what you're interested in, start the discussion. That will sort of filter through, and then through our various partners, we might be able to address that issue and provide that kind of support. And similarly, I like the idea from our colleague from DRC to encourage awareness in those countries where awareness is, it's not really very well known. Then if you contact through our FAO office, then similarly we will make sure that we send materials out to you and provide whatever assistance and support we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. Iba?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Abebe. I'll try to respond very briefly. First, the question on the language. Is the language not too strong? I would say that I'm borrowing this language from the framework and guidelines. Talking about the women's land rights, they said clearly, this is undemocratic. And it's important also to know from where this language is coming from. I think that the framework and guidelines on women has been strongly fed by the input of women themselves. So that's how they felt it. That's undemocratic to exclude part of the citizens from access to land. And I think that the rationale is really deconstructing and reconstructing in order to give solid foundation for change. But I would advise, if you are going on the field to make advocacy, don't use maybe this language as the first, not the language for approach to in a village where people might be shocked. If you tell them, okay, you're not giving the land to women, so you are undemocratic. I'm not promoting that. But from a theoretical perspective, that's the rationale. The second, how is it possible to link policy and practice? I think that's the most difficult. Dr. Abebe has been highlighting this at the level of the AU. I don't have a ready response for this, but I would say building on evidence. Evidence is critical to change when it comes to policy. Best practices and lessons, very important. What did we learn? What works, what doesn't work? And finally, issue of governance and rule of law. I think that's also critical. When we have laws in a country, these laws need to be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uber. I really apologize. I couldn't give enough time to participants. This place is known for strict time discipline. You see those, that time, sometimes they give themselves, the ambassadors and ministers of foreign affairs, 2 minutes each, and it counts and it stops. This is a very important area of discussion. I'm sure we are just beginning now, and discussions are going to continue. But we have to close this one right now, and I would like to thank the presenters here, Andrew, Clarissa, and Uber, and I would like to request you to give them a big round of applause for. Thank you. Now, yesterday there was one important event that we couldn't complete. I will take 5 minutes, just 5 minutes to complete it. And this is on the program, it is written launch of the AU guiding principles on large-scale land-based investments. Of course, we all appreciate the need for increased investment in Africa. And in fact, this is one of the provisions of the declaration in Malabo. We have to enhance investment, both public and private, for agricultural growth and transformation, land included. So this is something we need. And recently, there has been an improvement in terms of the flow of investment to Africa on land included, but especially when it comes to large-scale land-based investments in Africa, there are issues, there are concerns, and the concerns are related to risks. Risks associated with the process, the impact, and in particular on dispossession of access or rights of land to communities. And this is clearly against the principle of the framework and guidelines. If you look at the framework and guidelines, the title of it, it talks about efficiency. Why we have this framework and guidelines is because we want efficiency. We want to promote enhanced efficiency in our resource use. We want to enhance equity, both between men and women, but also intergenerational, including the future generation, the youth. And thirdly, environmental sustainability. It must be sustainable. So the risks are associated with whether the patterns of the large-scale land-based investments are going in opposite directions. We want to make sure that they stick to those principles. So we've been discussing about what can be done to help member states as they engage investors, particularly those large-scale investment, land-based investment, and also other actors. And the purpose is to ensure that the investment is a win-win and sustainable in terms of outcome. The Land Policy Initiative Secretariat was asked to undertake a study, an assessment of these issues, focusing on the large-scale land-based investments, and prepare guiding principles to support member states. And this was done. They have developed the principles, the guiding principles, which was validated, involving stakeholders, and subsequently adopted by the AU conference, joint conference of ministers of agriculture, rural development, fisheries, and aquaculture, which was held in May, last May, 2014. And we have now, I am very pleased to announce that we have the guiding principles on large-scale land-based investments, which is adopted by AU policy organs for us to use. Having this is one thing. Making use of this is another. The purpose for which this is prepared is to help our member states and other actors to enhance their capacities as they engage in different contractual arrangements with those investors. And therefore, this is supposed to be the launch. I have launched it. It's available in, thank you so much. It's available both in English and French. Each one of you will get a copy of this as you go out.